Welcome, everybody. My name's Am Johal. I'm director of SFU's Vancity Office of Community Engagement. Delighted that so many of you could join us for the discussion this evening with Joshua Clover, Stan Douglas, and Melanie O'Brian. I wanted to thank the Institute for the Humanities for also being a partner on this discussion. Moderating the discussion is going to be Melanie O'Brian. She's the director-curator of Simon Fraser University Galleries since 2012. And previously, she was a curator at the Power Plant in Toronto, where she curated an exhibition with Stan Douglas. She's been the director-curator of Art Speak in Vancouver and assistant curator at the Vancouver Art Gallery. Please welcome Melanie O'Brian.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Am. So I'm just going to be very brief in terms of why we're here this evening, really to have a conversation around Joshua Clover's new book, Riot, Strike, Riot. According to the PR that went out, that he will speak first, but in fact, we're going to change the order a little bit, and we're going to have Stan talk quickly about a series of photographs he did recently, Riots and Crowds. And then Joshua will follow with a short discussion of his book, in which he identifies our time as an age of riots, where the struggle of people versus state and capital has taken to the streets, and theorizes riot as the form of the coming insurrection. So I'll quickly do an introduction. First of Stan Douglas, who I'm sure is known to most of you, as a Vancouver-based artist whose work addresses social and cultural issues through historical and contextual lenses. He has created films, photographs, and installations that re-examine particular locations or past events. And one of the works that we'll be talking about tonight is located in the atrium and is visible from where I'm standing. Abbott and Cordova, 7th of August, 1971, which depicts a scene from the Gastown riots. His works take their point of departure in local settings from which broader issues can be identified. Making frequent use of both analog and digital technologies, Stan appropriates existing Hollywood genres, including murder mysteries and the Western, and borrows from classic literary works, most notably Samuel Beckett, Herman Melville, Franz Kafka, and most recently Joseph Conrad, to create ready-made contextual frameworks for his complex, reimagined narratives that pertain to particular locations or past events. And Joshua Clover, we're very pleased to have with us this evening as an acclaimed writer and professor of English at the University of California, Davis. He specializes in 20th and 21st century poetics, and poetry, Marxism, political economy, world systems analysis, crisis theory, and cultures of finance, with an interest in environment, feminism, and political struggle in literature. He's also a faculty member in the Department of Comparative Literature and affiliated faculty in French and Italian Department Film Studies program and the designated emphasis in critical theory. His earlier work includes another book on cultural theory, Bob Dylan Didn't Have This to Sing About, which I believe is from 1989, as well as article contributions to journals from Representations to Critical Inquiry and a column at The Nation. Forthcoming work focuses on poetry and the transformation of the world system. He has also published 3 books of poetry, most recently Red Epic, been translated into several languages, and appears in many anthologies, including the Norton Introduction to Literature. So I'd now like to have Stan come up and talk about Crowds and Riots.
Thanks, Melanie. I'm going to begin with a fairy tale. Long, long ago, there were 2 kinds of people. One, the diligent, intelligent, and above all, frugal elite, and the other, lazy rascals, spending their substance and more on riotous living. Thus it came to pass that the former sort accumulated wealth, and the latter had nothing to sell but their skins. This is a story from the 19th century, which refers to the idea of riot in a kind of an arcane fashion, an older, archaic fashion. Riot as being something which is just being unruly in some sense. But it wasn't until the late 18th century when the Riot Act was written into the English common law in 1751. This basically gave the police the permission to arrest, prison, and fine any group of people of 10 or more who they felt to be unruly and somehow threatening the public body. This became, of course, a part of Canadian common law in the early 20th century and was used just around the corner at Victory Square by Mayor Jerry McGeer, who read the Riot Act to a bunch of unemployed men who had been fed up with the living conditions at the various relief homes that they had during the Depression and were planning to go on to Ottawa. And this precipitated a riot when the police came in, a police riot, in fact, which lasted many, many hours that evening. I begin this because what I'm talking about in my work is the assembly of people, and the four works that I made. Works I made in 2008 leading up to the large mural you see in the Woodward's atrium, which was called Crowns and Riots. I want to make a context for the work in the sense of giving the sense of how public assembly means different things in different contexts over a period of time. This is from the Powell Street grounds, or the scene from the Powell Street grounds in January 1912, an event called the Free Speech Demonstrations. Basically, the people in the city who had a certain paranoia about the Wobblies who were in town coming up from California, trying to organize unemployed men, had banned the assembly of more than 10 people by any group aside from the Salvation Army in Vancouver. And this is a case where, in a way, the assembled people, there are thousands of people in Powell Street grounds, which is now just down the street. What's the name of it now? Excuse me? Oppenheimer Park. Which is a place where often sports events would happen, civic events would happen. But in that case, this audience was there, and an audience to the Wobblies, the organizers, being taken away. So it didn't actually turn into a riot, but we had this idea of external agents coming in, trying to create a group or a body out of the crowd who assembled in that case. The next one is more an internal organization, which is very closely related to what happened in April 1935 at Victory Square. This is the Battle of Ballantine Pier, which is a case where the longshoremen who had been working at Ballantine Pier had organized themselves into a union. And then the people who ran the pier decided to penalize any of the workers who had joined that union and began stopping giving work. They decided to protest this by preventing any scab laborers from going to the waterfront. And then the businesses brought in the city police, provincial police, and RCMP to, again, create a police riot, which then lasted for about 3 hours in the whole neighborhood of Strathcona. This event was quite acrimonious, and it actually, a friend of mine saw it when I was making this piece and said, is that the Battle of Ballantine Pier? Because her grandfather was a merchant marine, and apparently this event had divided much of the maritime community for even today to a certain degree. The next in the series was this piece from called Hastings Park, 1955. Shows a group of people at the racetrack waiting for the races to start, to gamble. Again, they've been sort of formed into a group, but in this case without their knowledge. They've been formed in a sense into a consumer society, that sort of category that was thought to be the engine that would make a perpetual motion machine to drive capitalism in the post-war period. If they paid people enough to buy the goods they make, in a way there could be sort of endless reproduction of capital, which of course began to unravel later in the 20th century. The series culminates in this piece. In many ways, those early photographs were to give a historical context to what happened in 1971 with the Gastown riot. In this case, where hippies decided, like sort of entitled middle-class kids often do, that they could do what they want, where they want. And as they began to hang out in the industrial buildings in downtown Vancouver, the downtown east side, they felt they're being harassed by police who began to tell them that they were selling drugs, they shouldn't be here, and they didn't want them mixing with the working class men who were in the old beer taverns in the downtown east side. Anyway, being entitled kids, they thought they could do what they want. They went out and organized a street festival where they had bands playing, they gave out popcorn, they gave out flowers, they gave out watermelon, and it was kind of a nice festival during the day until Chief Abercrombie from the police came and told them to clear the streets, in effect read the Riot Act to them. But then two things were happening. On one hand, some police were trying to clear the streets. Other ones were trying to detain who they thought were troublemakers. So you see there's certain characters who are kind of look like hippies but have riot sticks and helmets. These are the narcs who were hanging out, trying to identify drug leaders, troublemakers, so they could arrest them later on. Because there was riot police coming from the east, there was water to the north, additional reservists coming from the west, and a very sort of small place to the south to escape, it caused a real sense of entrapment, fear, and anxiety on all parts. The police aren't used to causing police riots, and the hippies certainly had not been used to that thing as well. Now, when I was doing this project, there was other things I was considering, including the 1907 anti-Asic riots in Vancouver, which was an important event, but in a way beyond my means to stage because I'd have to build Chinatown from the era. Of course, but later on, if it had happened later, I definitely would have included the hockey riots that happened in 2011. Because I think this is kind of an important moment in the history of this idea of people assembling in groups over time. In effect, what this documents is the assembly of people into sort of bodies that could oppose power of a certain sort, but without the fear of communism on the one hand and trade unionism on the other. Little by little, the people in power become less and less afraid of the people. And so they feel they can do what they want. And I think in 2011, what happened is that people had enough in the Arab Spring, those 10 or so countries in the Arab world, in Vancouver with those hockey riots, which in effect are a class riot to a certain degree, as well as what happened in Tottenham with the Tottenham, which began as a traditional race riot, but then turned into an economic riot, and then spread to Hackney, Croydon, and I think 10 other cities around the UK. And so 2011 became definitely the year of riots, which I think in effect is probably a summation of what we'll hear about later in Joshua's talk. Thank you.
I'm actually just going to leave that image up there, and if I don't talk directly about the image, I'm no art historian or even scholar of art by any imagination, but the image has been really significant for me, and it marks an important date in the account I'm going to try to give, so I want to just leave it up there as sort of a touchstone. It's nice to see you all. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you so much, Stan, for being part of this. I wrote the book in many regards because, well, I'm interested in riots. One hopes to write books about things one is interested in, although it doesn't always work out that way. But one of the things I noticed is that the conventional definitions of riot provided by people who've written about it and talked about it are extraordinarily terrible. At a minimum, I wanted to redefine, rethink what a riot was in trying to understand our contemporary situation and predicament and why we're seeing more and more riots and what this might forecast for us about the future and to understand them historically. The main misdefinition of the riot, and it was sort of implicit in that opening fable or parable that Stan offered, has to do with the word tumult is actually in English endlessly associated with it. It has to do with public disturbance, traditionally, a disturbance of the peace by at least 3 people. Very often laws hold that it's 12 people. I don't know why that is, but it seems a convention internationally that 12 people acting violently, and it has to be violent, disturbing the peace makes a riot. The one thing you'll notice about that's particularly curious, it's like the negative image of a jury, right? It's 12 people who come together to do the opposite of the law in some sense. But this is that definition, which depends on violence and mayhem and disorder, has several problems with it. I could name, in fact, quite a few, but I want to focus on a couple. One, it's inadequately descriptive. Among other things, the strike, to which the riot is always opposed, is historically an incredibly violent event. In sort of contemporary ideology, people have re-narrated the strike, right? So it's ascetic, it involves orderly marching, it involves following laws, it involves the downing of tools. But historically, that's just not what strikes are. They're arguably as violent as riots. If you think about the Colorado coalfield wars and with the Ludlow massacre, if you think about there's 2 strikes in Lyon in France in 1831, 1834 that involve barricade fighting in the city and considerable death. So that distinction doesn't work well at all. But perhaps more importantly for me, that distinction fails because it implies that riots, as sort of a figure of disorder, can't have a politics to them in any substantial way. That they're simply these eruptions, they're irrational, they're disordered, as opposed to the order of the strike, and thus can't be identified as either being brought into being by a particular historical order or having their own sort of political goals and horizons. And even quite smart and quite politically progressive people often can't understand what the politics of a riot might be, aside from sort of a sudden, inchoate expression of immiseration. And that seemed inadequate to me, of my experience of what people are doing in these situations. And so I wanted to think through that. And that's in many ways the occasion for the book. That's one of the reasons it's such a pleasure to be here. I've been traveling around to various places, and I knew coming to Vancouver that there was at least one person who understood quite well what riots were and what their inner character was. And I knew that from looking at Stan's work. So I immediately was like, dear Stan Douglas, who I'd never met. I'm coming to Vancouver. I'd like to talk about riots. Will you talk about them with me? And I'm not sure what I expected, but I got a very generous response. So I'm really grateful for that, and grateful to have the chance to get to this conversation. Before I do that, I'm going to try and locate this 1971 riot and riots in this period in general in relation to a couple of things. So one thing I want to locate it in relation to is another event that happened relatively nearby, the Wood Squat in 2002, and make a case for the deep relationship of those two episodes or events. And the other thing I want to relate this riot to is the entire history of the West since 1347. I'm going to try and do that fairly swiftly. We don't have all night, and there's drinks waiting, so I'll try and move through it as swiftly as I can, and hopefully in doing the latter, it will also achieve the former. So it's in some sense uncontroversial. It's just sort of empirically the case that in the West, and I don't claim much expertise. I think the tradition of riots in, for example, the Indian subcontinent, in China in particular, in Korea, in lots of places, quite fascinating. There's great scholars on that topic. I'm not one of them. My claims that I make are largely for what I refer to as the early industrializing nations, so Western Europe, the UK, and US, Canada. And I don't have any terribly strong claims about the rest of the world. In that part of the globe, I think it's fairly uncontroversial to note that there have been these three cycles in which what Charles Tilly calls the leading form in the repertoire of collective action has shifted from the riot, which predominates from, let's say, 1600 to 1800. I actually start my story in 1347, and I might talk about that for a second. But really, the main period of riots is 1600 to 1800. I want to distinguish them from risings of the poor, which have existed as long as the poor have existed. I have a sort of particular account of what distinguishes the riot from other kinds of risings of the poor. And that is supplanted as a leading form by the strike. The first transfer, riot to strike, happens between about 1790 and 1830, more or less. It happens slowly in ways that are hard for people to recognize, but it happens fairly decisively, and the strike is really the dominant form of struggle that people engage in the West until the next transfer, or the corresponding transfer from strike back to riot, that begins in about 1965. These dates are imperfect. About 1965, and by 1975 has really taken hold, 79. Since 1979 in the US, for example, we've seen a massive decline in substantial labor actions. If you look at a chart of strike actions involving 1,000 people in the US, it declines from a high of about 1,000 a year to about a low of about 2 or 3 a year over the last couple of decades. So a total collapse in that, whereas riots have increased both in number and intensity, and also sort of in their spectacular appearance in the media landscape pretty dramatically over this period as well. So the question we would have to ask is, well, why that cycle of what I call riot, strike, riot, prime? By riot prime, I mean that when the riot returns, seemingly from its roots in the 16th or 17th centuries, it returns quite different. It doesn't look exactly the same, but there are also real continuities between them. And the argument I try to work through in the book, which I can't really do justice tonight, has to do with telling a sort of macroeconomic history of the overdeveloped nations, which argues that you have a period in which the economy of the West, this period again from the, from the beginning of market dependency, when people are sort of increasingly required to make their way in the world by buying goods in the market. When that begins, and it's hard to date exactly when that begins, market dependency is the beginning of the riot era. And that's a circulation-centered economy. So circulation, the sphere of circulation, right, includes exchange, distribution, and consumption. And so in the era of market dependency, the first era of circulation is dominated by riots. Then you get the rise of production, notably manufacturing and industrial production. That happens with the Industrial Revolution. It takes off, or it begins 1784 as a traditional date, but it really takes off in the West in the early 19th century. And then you move from a market dependency to a wage dependency, where the wage form becomes generalized, and almost everyone is drawn into the formal wage. And this is the period in which strikes dominate. And then you get a period of massive economic decline and deindustrialization in the West. And you start to shift back to a circulation-dominated economic sphere. Now, I want to make some disavowals before this gets taken as a larger claim than it is. The economy always has to have both circulation and production. They both have to be present for an economy to work. I'm not claiming that there's just a period of circulation and then just a period of production. Moreover, I don't want to be heard to be saying that there's a period where there's only riots and then only strikes and only riots. In fact, as Stan makes clear, there have been riots fairly evenly throughout history. However, you do have more and less in various periods, and you have relatively more or less decisively in relation to strikes. And that really is quite clear. There's essentially no strikes before the word gets invented in 1768. It has a really interesting history, and the language has a far more interesting history in French. If you want to do like French philology of the word for strike, we'll do that later with drinks. The French word for riot is émeute, which you actually can still hear. We used to call riots in English emotions, which is the same as émeute, right? And that, Leanne? Hey, you're far from home. It's good to see you. But that sense of the riot has persisted. But so there have always been strikes, there have always been riots, but it's a question of which form dominates. And just as with the structure of capital, it's a question of which mode dominates. So we have a circulation-dominated mode, which is to say merchants and the market in this period from, again, 16th, 17th, 18th century. Then a production-dominated mode, manufacture, factories, and so on. And then we've returned to a circulation-dominated mode. Circulation now appears in various ways. Certainly finance is one mode of circulation. Financial capital is in fact the same as merchant capital that you have back in the 16th century. It's a version of banking capital. And finance, in fact, serves not to generate any new value, right, but to spin things faster and faster, to make money move faster and faster, and to try and generate profits that way. Similarly, in this period, we've seen huge build-outs of shipping, right, designed to move products faster and faster without, in fact, generating any new products that generate value. So these are examples of the way that circulation starts to dominate the economy after the late 60s, early 70s, and there's a reason. In the West, the profit rate, to put it as crudely as possible, collapses around 1972, 1973. So we have a huge boom. I know my data on the US better than I know my data on Canada, I will admit. But they actually track fairly closely together. 1947 to 1973 is the largest economic boom in the history of the globe, by far. And across the West, not just in the US, it's called the Trente Glorieuses in France. It's true across the West. It's a huge boom in Canada. And it ends pretty aggressively. So that, and here's the famous fact, the best year after 1973 for the economy at large, the best year is worse than the worst year between 1947 and 73. So there's a massive decline in profitability in the productive sectors, manufacture.
Which year?
73 is the huge.
What's the best year?
What's the best year in that period? After 73, there's a non-trivial recovery in the late 90s, 96, 97, 98. And those are the best economic years for the West post 73. But they turn out to be part of a bubble that will blow in 2000, 2001. In this period, with this massive sort of collapse in the profitability in these sectors, you get this restructuring. and you get a double leap into circulation. So I've already talked a little bit about how capital leaps into circulation. It leaps into finance, which always accompanies crisis, right? Finance blows bubbles, which lead to crises. And you get this leap into kinds of circulation, because when profit rate gets lower for each individual widget, as we say, then you have to sell more widgets faster and faster because you're making less per widget. So you shift to circulation, and capital seeks profits there. There's the other half of the leap to circulation, which is not just that capital goes there, but bodies go there. They go there in two ways. One, there's more and more jobs in that sector of the economy. Service jobs that do circulation work. It will not surprise you to discover that FedEx, Federal Express, gets invented in 1973. It's really quite decisive, this takeoff in various kinds of circulation strategies right at this moment, between 65 and 73, which is why this is such a significant moment. We'll come back to that. And so in my argument, right, so there's not just the shift of people into circulation work, but out of the formal wage altogether, which is also a shift out of production into circulation, into the marketplace. You get people who are required to still make their living and survive in the marketplace. They're still market dependent, as we say, but they have no jobs. They've been expelled from the formal economy altogether. And we've seen that as a rising tendency since the 60s, what we call surplus population. So people who are excluded from the formal wage, of course, they still have to make a living somehow, so they end up doing what we call petty production or informal labor. This includes, and you can walk around this neighborhood, you know what I mean, right? This includes sex work. This includes selling drugs. It also includes things like doing shoe shines or giving haircuts in your living room. It includes things like reselling individual cigarettes, Lucy's as they're called, on the street corner. Right? That's what Eric Garner gets killed for in Long Island, setting off huge riots in New York in 2014. So you get people, you get bodies, humans, right, moved out of production into circulation, either as circulation workers or as excluded people altogether. It's interesting. I know that Maurizio Lazzarato spoke here last month. Is that right? Last month? I think that's right. Is anyone here at that talk? Curious, a couple of people at the talk. So he has these couple really compelling books about debt as the fundamental structure of the contemporary world. He takes it from this important sentence in Gilles Deleuze's essay, Postscript on the Society of Control, where Deleuze says, man, if you translate it that way, is no longer man enclosed, but man indebted. Let's claim this fundamental shift in the structure. We're no longer like enclosed, exploited by capital. We're simply indebted, and that's the way that capital gets money out of us. Now, I know what he means, but Lazzarato would have done well to read the next sentence in that Deleuze essay, which he doesn't read, which says, of course, 3/4 of the globe is too poor for debt, living in shanty towns across the world. This is an important fact. Debt is a powerful phenomenon, and it's particularly powerful for us in the overdeveloped world. It's a far less powerful phenomenon across the globe. What's far more powerful there is total exclusion from the economy. So if you have living around Mumbai or around Sao Paulo or around any number of Kinshasa, 10 million people who are excluded from the formal economy living in a ring around those cities. This is what we mean by surplus population. And increasingly, you see that in the US too. In fact, it happens first in the industrializing cities. People get excluded from the economy in ways that are highly racialized, largely through a policy that unions have of last hired, first fired. So you get black agricultural workers who move up to industrial cities, get jobs fairly late. Unions prevent blacks from joining until the 1930s and 1940s, and they get fired first. And you have a massive production of surplus population, especially among black Americans, but not only, in these post-industrial cities in the US. It turns out these are where the riots are. Riots, and here is the payoff of my claim, right, are the form of struggle that goes with the shift into circulation. It's the leading form of what I call circulation struggles. So just as we've had these 3 cycles, riot, strike, riot, we've had these 3 cycles, circulation, production, circulation. And the riot is the leading form of circulation struggle because, in the simplest form, people fight where they are. If you're not in the production structure, you don't strike because you can't. You fight where you are. And where you are is in the market and in the street. These are the 2 places that people are pushed into. By the market, I mean the place where you have to make a living, get the necessary things you need in the world to survive. And this is the historical distinction on which I tried to draw out the book, right, is that riots are a form of price setting. They're a struggle over the price of market goods. This is what the bread riot was historically. And strikes are setting the value of labor power, right? So riots try to set the value of market goods, and strikes try to set the value of labor power. And this distinction, rather than sort of nonsense about a dozen people and nonsense and tumult and disorder, that distinction does a pretty effective job of dividing up these activities historically. So it should not just surprise you, I hope, that the very first riots I identify in 1347 happen at two ports in England, Bristol and King's Lynn, where they're shipping grain out of town. In fact, they're shipping it to France during the 100 Years' War, and people are starving. People can only make their way in the world by buying things in the market. We're getting the beginning of market dependency. And they go to the market, but they discover there's no grain there because it's being shipped for a higher price to France. The emerging world market is what begins riots, because it suddenly creates this structure in which people are going to struggle to afford the things they need to live. Now, riots turn out to be incredibly effective at doing this. This is something that's greatly overlooked. As a strategy of reform, riots are historically probably more effective than strikes. If you think about all the countries, the US is not one, Canada is not one, but all the countries in the world where the government sets the price for a loaf of bread or a kilo of tortillas or various other things, that's all the outcome of riots. Riots got that, right? Bread riots, that's what they are. And governments have tried to manage those in various ways. So riots have this history of struggling over the price of goods, which is to say they have a history of being the struggles of people who have to make their living in the world, to survive in the world, in the marketplace, not in the workplace. And so when we see a rise in riots, what we're seeing is a rise in this category of circulation struggles. Now, the riot is not the only kind of circulation struggle. Like a barricade would be an example of a circulation struggle, trying to shut down circulation. In fact, the great majority of riots in the period from 1347 to 1800 are not actually bread riots where you go to the bakers, but they're what I call export riots, where they block grain from being shipped out of a parish or a county. So it's quite interesting when we see that form come back. When you look at the Ferguson riots that happened, there's two rounds of riots after the killing of Michael Brown and Ferguson. The first one are local to Ferguson. We'll call that Ferguson 1. And then there's the national wave of riots in the US that happen when the officer, Darren Wilson, who murders Michael Brown, is not indicted. And they all take the same form of blocking the freeway. 60 cities across the United States, people block the freeway, and if there's no freeway in their town, they block the biggest road. It's actually a perfect repeat of the form of the riot from the 15th, 16th, 17th century. So we can think of the riot, we can think of the barricade, but we can also think of the occupation as also a form of circulation struggle, right? An occupation is a kind of struggle you can engage in when you can't strike, when you don't have access to the wage, or that's not where the center of capital's power is. And so you fight instead in the space of circulation in an occupation. So if you think about Occupy Wall Street or the various other Occupy encampments, this is a classic example. Where do they gather? They gather in public plazas over and over again, what the Greeks called the agora, which has those two meanings, right? The place of public speaking and the market, which is exactly what that plaza is. And this is where struggle returns to in this age of a sort of restructured global economy, this restructured class composition. So I think it's important to understand that occupation and the riot are fundamentally joined. They're both forms of this thing I call the circulation strategy. And it's these we're going to see more and more of in the next few years, because this changing structure of the economy, jobs, absence of jobs, is not slowing down, it's not reversing, it's in fact increasing, notably so. So it seems to me inevitable that we're going to see more and more of these struggles, riots among them, but not only riots, all these various forms. So that's sort of the framework I want to offer for how we can think the status of the riot, its, the certainty with which it's going to increase, but also its relation to these other kinds of struggles that we see in an attempt to sort of have a unified picture of what the repertoire of collective action is going to look like, not necessarily for us in this room, but for most of the people on the globe over the next 5 or 10 or 40 or 60 years. The book, I should note, is not a work of advocacy. This is the last thing I want to say before we move into conversation. People often hear this, especially people who are historically committed to the strike, and they hear me saying, but how dare you say the strike is dead, and how dare you advocate the riot? I'm not advocating shit. I'm trying to understand what's going on, and there really has been this dramatic shift in what people do. That's what I want to understand. I'm not very interested in a normative politics where I say, what we've been doing doesn't work, we should do this. There's lots of people who will do that for you. I don't trust them. But that's not what I'm interested in. I'm interested in understanding the affordances of the actual condition in which we find ourselves. And it's within that understanding that we can then perhaps start to talk together and figure out what we might want to do next. Thank you all very much.
Well, thank you for that. These seem to be working, so that's great. I think that the place to start, because I think you both have many directions that this could go in, but I think just to begin the conversation to revisit the 1970s, 1971 in particular, I think would be a useful way to kind of get into conversation. And I'm just thinking that when we were talking earlier, Stan has really thought about the 1970s also quite widely in your work recently as a kind of transitional moment beyond simply the riot. So the sort of long crisis that you refer to is perhaps an interesting place to start.
Yeah, the 70s have been sort of an ongoing preoccupation in my work, in as much as this year, 1973, is kind of where everything changed. We had a dramatic transformation of the economic system, but also culturally, in the period that was often quite one of recession, one of extremity, but still culturally was kind of left a lot of opportunities for people to change the way in which they communicated through the various arts, which I found fascinating. But yeah, this is kind of a pivot moment in the post-war period, which, as you said, there's been no other period with more productivity in human history. But since then to now, there's been more wealth created than any time in human history, but productivity has dropped, as you said.
Well, I'm going to test to see if this microphone is working. Can I have a glass of white wine? Yeah. Did you hear that? Okay, thanks. We'll see if it's working shortly. Right, well, I'm going to get a little wonky, right? So productivity keeps increasing by the technical measure, which is to say number of widgets output per labor hour spent. In that sense, productivity is increasing. What's not being produced is new value, right? There's no accumulation, as they say. There's no total wealth. There's actually not been a lot of wealth creation in this period. This is where I disagree with you. There's been a huge reorganization of wealth and a great concentration. So the rich have gotten much, much, much richer. The poor, on average, have gotten poorer. What there hasn't been is an expansion of the system where, hypothetically at least, a rising tide lifts all boats. We know it doesn't quite work that way. But there is a meaningful expansion of global wealth in that period, 47 to 73. Since 73, there's actually been very little. What we've seen is a recirculation of profits so that the rich have radically increased their command over the available wealth.
And you wouldn't say that the certain procedures like the certain kinds of fictive capital, which should produce things like these monetary instruments which create capital out of nothing, which have no real connection to productivity whatsoever, finance capital in general, these are contributing to a accumulation of wealth that wasn't there before in the previous period?
Yeah, no, they don't accumulate, in my measure at least. I mean, I just read books. In my understanding, they don't accumulate any new wealth at all, right? Their claims, finance capital, or fictitious capital, as you say, is exactly its claim on future work. That's all it can be. So you buy a house. I'm not recommending that. It's a hypothetical. Right? And you sign a mortgage. Now, that hasn't created any wealth, right? There's exactly as many houses as there were before. There's as much food. There's as much all stuff. Nothing new has been created. But you have a mortgage now for whatever a house costs in Vancouver, 70, 80 bucks. No, you have a house for $500,000. It's a little. It's one of those new condos. No, I don't know, sorry, $1 million, $2 million, whatever it is. But the point is, there's no new money that suddenly, there's not $1 million more in the world. There's simply a liability for that, and you're going to do $1 million worth of work in the future. I salute you. But what if that work never happens? Right? You sign the mortgage. Hypothetically, there's now $1 million more in wealth. And then you lose your job because of, let's say, automation, which is by far the main reason people lose their jobs. Not offshoring, not shipping jobs elsewhere. Automation is by far the main reason jobs disappear. Perhaps you read that 60,000 Foxconn workers in China are being replaced by robots. This news just came out 2 days ago, I think. Now you don't do the work. You don't pay the mortgage. Well, what happens? You default. The $1 million goes poof. It was fictitious. It never existed. It was a promise about something that was going to happen later. And if that thing doesn't happen, no wealth creation. So in that sense, these are temporary. You see what seems to be huge wealth creation, and then a bubble comes and wipes it all out, and they say, we lost $1 trillion overnight. We didn't lose anything. The fictitious money revealed itself as fictitious.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I wish people heard you, but I guess your mic's not working.
It is baffling that this mic does not seem to be working. Jeff Dirksen, are you not my friend? Can I not have a glass of white wine?
Am will do it.
Maybe there's some kind of legal thing they can't. Anyway, I haven't read your book. I've read the introduction that you sent me, but you must have dealt with it at some point. But I'm wondering about the what does the figure of the protest? How does that figure into your work? Because the protest is kind of a strikey kind of riot. It's an unruly kind of protest. But something has happened with that as well. Like if you look at the way in which protests are responded to by governments in terms of as a message from people. A group of people were sending a message saying that they need something done, to say with the demonstrations in London in 2008, where basically they were ignored in police, or even all of the Gulf War protests in 2003, they were just completely ignored and policed, and that was it.
Yeah, this is. I talk about this a bit in the last chapter. So it's striking that the Gulf War protests are a good example. By pretty much any measure we have, the largest global protests in the history of the world. Effect, literally none, right? And there's, I'm gonna, as I'm inclined to do now, give you like a sweeping historical claim about why this is the case. This is what you paid the money for here tonight. And I'm gonna do so via talking about the Ferguson riots, if I can. So Ferguson 1, which happens in Ferguson in August of 2014, is, and this is easy to forget, even in the US, even nearby, by pretty much every measure available, the longest riots in the history of the United States. Now let's think about that for a second. The longest riots in the history of the United States happened in 2014. Now why is that the case? I have an account, and here's basically what it is. So it's entirely common for a riot, almost as soon as it happens, for there to be an intense split in sort of what we might call the population of riot, those people who went out the first night or the second night. And one side, I have slightly theoretical sounding names for them in the book. It's not important. One side is the side that essentially wants to turn it into a protest, that wants it to be peaceful, that wants to engage in traditional civil disobedience. I call this the discursive side, right? They want to make claims, they want to negotiate, they want to speak to the media, they want to be appealing, they want to bring more people in, they want to hold the moral high ground, they want to make demands, and hopefully ones that can be met. Then there's the side I call the practical side. Slightly counterintuitive name. By practical side, I mean they continue to do practical activities. The classic ones are trying to destroy the power of the police and to make the neighborhood uninhabitable by people they don't want to see around, often by destroying property and burning things. Now that may not seem practical to you, but you understand what I mean by practical. They involve activities rather than demands and claims. Now, over the course of the 20th century, over and over again, that first side wins very quickly, right? There's a clash between the two sides, and the first side wins very quickly. And we can say, well, of course they win. They're more likable, they're more charming, they're more plausible. No one's really going to destroy the police, in a riot. And that's the case. There's certainly a more sympathetic side, and they're certainly more sympathetic to the powers that be. The government likes that side. They might pretend not to, but they like that side. Liberals like that side. That side's very popular. And nobody likes the people who are shooting at the police. And this is an important salient feature of the Ferguson riots, is that kids were in a shooting war with the cops for 3 nights, which is quite interesting. So the question is, given that the split tends to close pretty quickly, why did it not close in Ferguson? Because that's what gives Ferguson its incredible duration, right, is that that split doesn't close. The peaceful side doesn't win out. People don't agree just to march in a circle saying, hands up, don't shoot. I should state, I'm try to speak with not with the authority of someone who's only read books, but in this case I was in Ferguson. I went there and spent some time there during the riots. So why doesn't that first side win out? Well, the answer, I think, is pretty clear, because there's no more gains to be gotten. In 1955, that side won because they could make demands that would be met. There could be great, you could make the Great Society demands, the invention of HUD. The government will concede as little as possible, but it will buy the social peace if it can. The government, let's remember, is incredibly rich in the period from 1947 to 73, and after that, the government gets poor, and the tax base collapses, and the tax revolts begin. I know we can say the money's out there, and there's billions of dollars whirling through cyberspace every millisecond. I get that. The government is extraordinarily poor, relatively speaking, after the mid-70s, and they can't meet the demands. And once the government can't meet the demands and everybody knows it, the first side can't win so easily. And so the split stays open. When people know that even the most minimal demands, plausible, reasonable, sensible demands, are not going to be met, it's very hard for that side to win the debate. And this is the situation we're in. And this is why protests can't be successful. The way I describe it always is that we're in a situation of all sticks, no carrots. The government used to have carrots to try and buy the social peace. Hell, there used to be welfare benefits in the United States. There used to be substantial unemployment. There's not anymore. And similarly, at a global level, the US is all sticks, no carrots, as I'm sure you've noticed. And that's what happens in this sort of global political economic situation. Protests are relatively ineffective, and other kinds of struggles are guaranteed in that situation. Sorry, that was a long answer to a short question, but I warned you.
Another short question. You use this sort of description, which is very, very general, obviously not absolute. You say there's riot, strike, riot, prime. Obviously in allusion to the idea of money, commodity, money prime, where you spend your money, you make your commodity, you collect the surplus value, which is a prime. There's obviously some causal relationship in that. Are you saying there's some causal relation between the riot, the strike, and the riot prime?
You mean, does each one lead to the next?
Does somehow the striking produce the surplus riotiness of the second riot prime?
Well, no, and you're right. That's the moment when it's more like an analogy than an identity. I do want to argue that each one comes out of the other. So, for example, the first strikes all happen in the sphere of circulation. The very first strikes we have on record are all by sailors, and then they're in ports. They'll happen in the sphere of circulation. They make their way into production. It's the rise of that capitalist economy which draws the riot inward toward a new form, which is going to be the strike. So in my model, sort of like the form takes on a new content. So in 1830, for example, a bunch of workers storm into a boss's office in France, in Douai, and demand higher wages. So that's a strike by my measure, right? It's a struggle over the value of labor power, which is exactly what a strike is, all it ever was. They storm in, they take the boss hostage, a great French tradition, and they demand higher wages. And the local magistrate writes it up as a riot, because he just doesn't have the concept of a strike yet to register it. 10 years later, he will. So my argument is basically that that a new content starts to arise within the form. And similarly, when the riot starts to come out of the strike, we start to see initially, maybe ongoingly, riots that many people would start to identify as strikes. There's a great confusion over what they are, right? So people will blockade a factory, and people will think that's a strike, even though it's not a wage demand that's being made. And so that's the sense in which each one leads into the other. But I don't necessarily, I'm not sure I want to claim that the strike, for example, necessitates riot prime. The strike registers an economy which is going to hollow itself out, and that's going to necessitate riot prime.
Or perhaps even that the strike demonstrates a certain efficacy on the part of the people who are asking for sort of wage, a shift in the wages, that they realize if they take that possibility away, this is a strategy that can be used by the people running the business, and that produces the riot prime.
I like that version better than mine. Let's do that. So, I mean, I want to ask you, if I could, a question or two. Is that okay? Is that fair?
Yeah, absolutely.
That's not breaking the rules. So in terms of cultural history, I can certainly, from my, I was once a poetry scholar, and it's quite striking that North American poetry does change very dramatically in this period, like late 60s, early 70s. There's a significant wave of avant-garde invention that probably hasn't been equaled since. I'm not saying it's good, but it's notable. Is your sense and your interest in the 70s that there's a similar transformation in the other arts, and is that part of why you get so interested in that period?
Sorry, could you say that a bit different? I was distracted.
Do you have a sense that that other arts start to transform and go through real sort of I don't know what it is, volatile shifts in the 70s?
I've been kind of considering this in some work I'm doing. I'm editing a book of these lectures that happened in the 80s and 90s at Art Center where I teach in California. And there's a certain anxiety about postmodernism on almost everybody. They talk about, some people say we should ban the word postmodern. It doesn't, because so many bad things have been done in the name of postmodernism, such as,
Not just ban it, we should kill people who use it. Oh, sorry, that was extreme.
Such as neo-geo, appropriation, blah, blah, blah. And they're embarrassed by this. But in a way, what happened in this period is there's a certain teleology of American art that had come to a close around this time. You had Greenberg's idea of a false idea, I think, about a teleology that he derives from Kant, I think incorrectly, that somehow America could appropriate the idea of Western art history, and they could be the culmination of that, and it would be somehow reducing it to the flatness of the picture prey. That the essence of painting is that it's rectangular and it's flat, which is kind of a ridiculous notion if you think about it. In a way, that's not a truly avant-garde way of thinking about it. The historical avant-garde would be happy if you think of surrealists, dadaists, constructivists, to at a certain point giving up making paintings altogether, but somehow this is the Greenberg notion. Anyway, this begat minimal art, that begat conceptual art, and at a certain point there was nowhere left to go, and this was kind of the crisis that happened among the arts in the 1970s, which made the possibility of people going back to pictures, but also the sudden sense of there's no grounding, this idea of the free-floating signifier that came up again and again in that period, making the sort of justification for very ridiculous kinds of art. And people seeing this, suddenly this institution was taken away. What can we do now? Anyway, this kind of led me to the idea that in some sense, what happened with that was so-called modernist art in the post-war period was actually postmodern already, because it's not involved with negation. The essence, I think, of modernity is, or modern art is negation. Negation of tradition, negation of representation. But all of these postmodern ones are involved in, what Greenberg did was an act of appropriation and allegory. He appropriated a European form and added this allegorical teleology, which was not there before. But I think in around 1970s, this kind of fell apart. And what happened in the post-war period with things like Bretton Woods, the Marshall Plan, the idea of exporting U.S. capitalism to Europe, which may have gone communist, to have Bretton Woods, which would sort of institutionalize American capitalism. These were institutions which were, in a way, very different from the old imperial model. So that's just kind of a continuity which, and those contradictions sort of came up in the 70s. I don't think it's a break in the 70s, but actually the continuity with the reorganization of culture and power in the post-war period.
Thank you for that. The only thing I would like to add to that, right, is the obvious fact that in the datings of postmodernism, Frederick Jameson is most famously, and cultural logic of late capitalism, is 1973, right? It again comes back to this fundamental shift in the, in industrial, shift from industrial to finance capital and a recomposition of labor at a global level. And that's inseparable from these artistic periods. So, I mean, if I really wanted to press my point, I would say, well, he didn't mean postmodernism, he meant the age of riots. And they turn out to, in his account at least, match up fairly perfectly.
Right. We'll see his example, actually, in that period for the economic model. I don't remember this clearly, but it was not finance capital exactly, it was something else. In a way, if he rewrote it, he kind of did rewrite it recently, talking about singularities, but I forget, it doesn't matter.
Well, does it make sense to go back to some ideas that you put forward around just thinking about this notion of occupation? And so to come back to wood squat, perhaps, and come back to the particulars of this place that we're in, and thinking about occupying as part of the riot, but then how complicated that also becomes when we're sort of occupying on lands that are, I mean, one is the real estate question that you already raised, and in a kind of situation in which real estate is so out of control and the goods are so out of control, but then also that we're in a situation where Occupy, as someone pointed out to me earlier, has become a very contested kind of way of working, particularly around unceded lands, et cetera, and how that then, of course, the Occupy movement in Canada transformed into Idle No More, et cetera. So I wonder if maybe you would unpack for us a little bit, and maybe you have something to say also about...
And by the way, you're not near the wood squat, you're actually in it.
We're in the wood squat, yeah.
That was me using an ironic formulation. Apparently didn't work. It's not, there's no irony in Canada, is that?
Oh no, right? We have plenty of that.
Oh. So you say. Yeah, I mean, I guess I want to be very tender in answering this question, since I think it's incredibly important that the situation vis-a-vis occupation and its concepts is different in Canada than it is in the United States. Certainly the same debate happened at Occupy Oakland, which I spent a lot of time at. I'm from Oakland. And the debate about the discomfort with the term Occupy and the interest in shifting its name to decolonize. I found it to be an interesting debate. I don't think it's unpackable in less than a few years of discussion. It's obviously a very vexed discussion. It's particularly perplexing in the United States because of the tradition of Native American struggles and genocide, but also the tradition of slavery, and the question of whether, and the annexing of those two ideas together. So in fact, it was often the argument was made in the United States that the term occupy was inadequately responsive to the history of slavery, particularly African to American slavery, which is, of course, African Americans make up a far larger population in the United States than Native Americans do. So I think it's actually, there's a lot of complex strands. They're almost impossible to disentangle, and it was hard to know who was speaking for who. It is worth noting, right, that the American Indian movement occupies Alcatraz Island in 1971. I think I have that day right, and they're happy to call it an occupation, right? Unproblematically, they identify that as an occupation. So I don't think it's always just as simple as, oh, the word occupy is intolerable to some people, which then sort of ends up essentializing those people and their political experience. So I sort of want to keep it fluid and also be very aware of the situation in Canada is, as my Canadian friends have reminded me over and over again every time I say something stupid, quite different.
But I guess that the occupation is kind of a slow protest in a funny way, a protest which takes place over a long period of time. But it's a very different kind of message. I mean, we can interpret a message out of the riot, but in the occupation and the demonstration, there is a message being produced by those who are doing it. So they're quite different things in a way. The Tottenham rioters, for example, I mean, they in a way have the aesthetic feeling this is the right thing to do. But it's not exactly that, I mean, and you can interpret this based on, say, it's the children of the people who rioted in '84 in Tottenham. And they've been in this condition of having, being jobless families for, 2 generations. So the conditions are clearly present for that, but as a demonstration, as an utterance, it's not as self-conscious as it is with the protests or the occupation.
I think we're about to break up. Yeah, I'm not, I mean, yes, I understand what you're saying. Yes, I think that's true. I don't give that a lot of, that doesn't have as much force in the way I think about these things as it might for some people. Maybe it's my training as a literary scholar, right, where I'm trained not to worry so much about the intention of the author and to try and understand the significance of an act, whatever the author's claim it's for. I think it's important for me not to read the riot as a communication, right? It's Martin Luther King. Here's the part where I disagree with Martin Luther King, which is never a good strategy. It's not a popular position, right? But he says the riot is the language of the unheard. And I just think that's a terrible mistake, to identify it as a language and to think that what the riot wants is to enter into communication and explain something to you and get something back. And it's a struggle for recognition in the traditional model of a politics of recognition. I just don't think that's what it is. I think a riot's desires are absolutely clear. The cops have to go. Shit costs too much. We can't live in the world as it's structured. I think it's absolutely clear. It's not a communication. It's an attempt to address those issues. It's not an attempt to name them. It's an attempt to deal with them. And in that sense, it's politically clearer than a bunch of people sitting around with signs saying, we want such and such. And because we're so trained, I mean we in this room, are so trained to register language as the fundamental political act, I think we don't always have access to this clarity, but I feel quite strongly about this.
Yeah, I'm not saying that it's not a message. It clearly is. This is clearly a message that's being in it, which means something in a context, often economically. But I'm saying it's a different kind of message.
Fair enough. I mean, I'm just not sure it's a. I mean, it's a message in the sense that everything communicates. I can't. I would be ludicrous to argue with that. I'd have to have several more glasses of wine. But. I think it means more directly to deal with issues, right? So is looting a communication? Well, sure. But mostly it's looting, right? Mostly it's, I am compelled to survive by getting things from the market, and I cannot afford to do so, and I will do that. People treat looting in contemporary riots as like, this horrible divagation or errancy that delegitimates the riot, as if anyone would ever really legitimate a riot. But there's this great pretense. Oh, if only they hadn't looted, we would understand. Those people have to go. So it's treated as a moment of like errancy and moral failing. As I've tried to suggest, in fact, that's the truth of the riot. That's what the riot always was. The riot was always going down to the baker or the wagon with grain on it or the ship with grain on it and saying, we're hungry, we're taking this. Looting is the truth of the riot. A lot of that other stuff is sort of paraphernalia. And that's a practical activity, right? And so while it certainly communicates, I really want to register its non-communicative force as both the truth of the riot and the substance of the kind of politics that are going to get pursued increasingly over the next, X time horizon.
It makes me want to ask a question about what a theory of riots might have in common with a theory of terror, but I think that is also then going to go in the opposite direction, which makes me think if you guys are ready, we could open it up to the audience, yeah? As I suspect people will have, yes, right here.
What kind of lesson can we learn from the Occupy Wall Street? In the beginning, we generated a lot of
I have some things to say, but I'm also curious. I mean, there was Occupy Vancouver. Do you have any sense of what that was about?
No.
No. Okay, then I'll answer. Well, it didn't fizzle out. It became the Bernie Sanders apparatus, which is an ambiguous fate. No, so I think that's a really important question. So here's a quick sequence I'll narrate for you, very quick. I'll start in Chicago. There's 1968. There's two riots. There's the Martin Luther King riots and then the Days of Rage riots at the Democratic National Convention. The first is marked as people of color. I'm not saying it was only people of color, but it's marked people of color. And the second is marked as white and mostly students. Let's jump forward to the 2000s. 2005 in France, you get the Clichy-sous-Bois riots, which spread across the nation, marked entirely people of color, mostly North African, Arabic immigrants. 2006, you get the student riots around CPE, a labor issue. So again, one riot marked people of color, one riot, same place, roughly the same time period, marked as white and students. Let's go to England. 2010, student riots, sacking of 30 Millbank, marked white, marked students. 2011, Tottenham, people of color. So you see the pattern. It's pretty clear. If you do it in Oakland, it comes out the same. Riots after Oscar Grant is killed in Oakland by communities of color. Student riots on campus that fall, marked white and students. So it's an interesting pairing that keeps happening over and over again. Here's the optimistic thing I'll say about Occupy, and I'm not often optimistic about Occupy. It's an attempt to bring those two riots together, right? Occupy, at least in the US, is an attempt to have a class alliance between two groups. One, a downwardly mobile middle class, mostly marked white, not entirely, realizing their future is more or less foreclosed, they're going to be worse and worse, and then a class of largely people of color who are already excluded and immiserated. These are the two profoundly political classes in the United States, but in different ways. That class alliance was not possible. They tried and it failed. That's not the main reason that the Occupies failed. There was massive state repression. That's the main thing that ended them. But this tentative class alliance couldn't quite be pulled off. I think it will become more possible over the next several years, particularly as the downwardly mobile middle class abandons all their fantasies that Bernie Sanders will save them or whatever it is. And when their future is even more foreclosed, we'll see more and more of a possibility of a class alliance between those two classes, and that will be what came of Occupy Wall Street.
I'm just kind of thinking out loud here, because I haven't really got it clear in my mind, because I don't know these things in great detail, but thinking about the 2005 riots in France and the 2011 riots in England, there's a kind of a direct relation between, no, that's not going to work. With France, I think exactly in the beginning of the Tottenham riots, and maybe the '84 Tottenham riots, which were definitely about a relationship to the police. This kind of representative of the state was there and was only there to sort of contain this group of people, never to have any kind of relationship with the people, or never to have a reciprocal one whatsoever. It's kind of a complete objection to this population, as opposed to those in Occupy who feel that they have some ability, some recourse to having their interests met in some way.
That's exactly right. That's one of the ways of describing why that class alliance couldn't happen, is because one group understood that they were, whether they wanted to be or not, the enemies of everything existing. Right? They understood that the police were never going to do anything for them, nor was the state. Right? And one class fraction, the downwardly mobile middle class, could still preserve a little bit of the fantasy, like if we just restore the Constitution, right, or whatever it is, there could be some resolution. And that's exactly right. One of the things that's important to note about changes in riots in the present compared to, say, the 17th century is a fundamental historical inversion, which is quite compelling, right? In the 17th century, for example, you could say the economy was near and the state is far. Almost everything people needed to live was made within 25 miles of where they lived. But there was no standing army, there was no police, they don't exist, right? In the town, there's maybe a couple bailiffs or a beadle, minimal policing. Now we're in the opposite situation. The economy is far, spread across global logistics chains, nothing is made near where you live. But the state is near. There's cops on every corner. And so when you enter into struggle, you have no choice but to throw yourself against the state, much more than the economy. And the more excluded you are, the more you're a surplus population that has to be disciplined by the police, right? So you have the hyper-incarceration since, when does hyper-incarceration take off in the United States?
1973?
Thank you. Right? This generation of surplus population for which there's no carrots, only sticks, open-air prison, the open-air prison of poor communities, the endless incarceration and expanding prison system, the confrontation with the state is absolute and inevitable. And that's a great question for the riot writers. How do you move past that? That's an important moment, but the riot has to turn to the economy as well. And that's a real challenge of how it goes about doing that.
Back there, John.
Joshua, thank you. Am I on here? It doesn't matter. Over here.
Oh, hi.
as you were talking about automation taking away jobs, and that being by far the prime force in the reduction in labor, it reminded me of Ian Bohl and his comments on Ned Ludd and his band of redeemers and the destruction of the looms. And I wonder why more doesn't happen in terms of the destruction, or am I wrong in thinking this, since 1973, in the destruction of those forces?
That's a great question. The corrupt and cheap answer is there's a chapter in the book about this. Yeah, there's a whole chapter about the Luddites and, of course, Captain Swing, which is the other great machine-breaking riots in England in that same period. Comes about a decade later, which involved less breaking of textile machinery and more agricultural machinery. But yeah, so that's a really interesting moment of confusion between the riot and the strike, right? When on the one hand, it looks like a riot. People are running around in this disorderly fashion and breaking things, and it's very violent. But it's clearly directed toward work and employment. That's why it's important to remember that the Luddites were not anti-technology. They were an anti-unemployment movement. Where every time someone says, like, you're such a Luddite because you don't like computers, please explain to them, because it hurts me when they make that mistake. But actually the question of why people don't do that more, I don't think there's any hope. Like, that was a moment in which there's a large-scale internalization of labor into the wage at that time. And it seems like an open horizon. Like, I could be internalized into the wage, I could make this money, I could have this income, and yet I'm being squeezed out of it here. Let's stop that from happening. We're not really in a moment where people can imagine that happening. I don't think there's any imagination of like, oh, the solution here is to be internalized into the wage. That's, the collapse of union struggles, I think, revolves around, in some sense, a fairly simple fact, which is that since the 80s, probably, almost all union struggles have been defensive, by which I don't only mean they've been struggles not to lose certain privileges or wage levels, but they've been struggles to keep industries in business. This is a very strange transformation of union struggles. This is not how unions understood what they were up to in the 1920s or 30s or 40s or 50s, like cutting deals to keep the bosses in business so they could keep on getting their pay. And that's largely been the stance of the labor movement, has been a remarkably urgent but pliable struggle to preserve capital. Given that that's the stance of the labor movement, it's a bit hard to imagine it shifting toward an aggressively anti-capitalist labor movement that smashed machines. I'm not opposed, but it's hard to imagine, and it's a great question.
Okay, we have a question here.
Climate change.
Hi.
Which my reckoning has been terribly polite to this point, protest actions around climate, in protest of climate change. I don't know what the question is, other than I would like to seed your imagination about some places we can go from here.
Oh gosh, so would I. Yeah, I mean, two things, neither of which will be satisfying to you or to me. One is, again, I can tell you what's going to happen. There's going to be more riots, but not just riots, and I'll get to back to that in a second. The other thing I will say that's very unsatisfying is if I knew the secret to how to get us from here to the Rev, that's the revolution. Yeah, that's hipster slang for the revolution. If I knew the secret of how to get from here to the Rev, we would not be in this room right now, right? It's the fact that I don't know the secret that has us stuck here. Here's my hopeful thing, I will say. It's going to be my crazy hopeful moment. You should really enjoy this because I don't have many. So the riot starts as a struggle about goods. Then we have the strike, which is a struggle about the wage. Now we have the return of the riot, but as I suggested with my note about the historical inversion, where now we have, it used to be economy near, state far, now it's state near, economy far. So we can no longer have the imagination, even when we riot, of somehow getting what we need to reproduce ourselves in the market, right? I can loot a bunch of stuff, enough for 2 weeks, a month maybe, But I can't really have that imagination you could have had in 1740, big wave of riots, that I could somehow get everything I needed, that everything that I needed to reproduce myself and my family and my community was there in the marketplace. That's not a possible imagining anymore. And that, to me, is the moment of optimism, which is to say, I think in this moment, we can start to imagine a struggle, because all struggles are about how we reproduce ourselves, how we can stay alive and be communities and care for each other. How we can imagine a struggle for reproduction that is neither based in the market or in the wage, right? Because those are those two struggles. The riot is the market struggle, the strike is the wage struggle, and we can now imagine, because neither one of those will save us, neither one of us will allow us to reproduce ourselves, we can now imagine a third kind of struggle, which is to reproduce ourselves outside market and outside wage. Now that's what I call the commune. I define the commune simply as being that form of struggle, the struggle for reproduction beyond market or wage. And I think we're arriving dialectically through this transformation, through the negation of the market, the negation of the wage, at a moment when such a struggle becomes imaginable and becomes possible. And I hope that we can think about what that will look like.
Oh, okay. Does someone have, okay, you have it, sorry.
She gave me the microphone.
That's great, go ahead.
A lot of power right now.
Just the way I like it. Okay. Well, thank you so much for the discussion, first of all. So I'm curious, kind of in the discussion of Riot, when it's what you're talking about, the practical elements of the smashing of windows, the looting, et cetera, and just reading that kind of as is, not with the intent, but with what we can read it as. And so I'm thinking as well then of the way in which the state responds violently. So the way in which the police, in response to smashing windows, essentially smashes heads. And so in that way then, it's saying kind of, because the police never or rarely get punished for that act, it's saying then that the material goods are worth protecting more than the bodies themselves. And so what I'm interested then in the way in which that the state, if it changes, the way in which the state's response changes and exerts power over the riots and the strikes, and if that changes accordingly, or if it's kind of a similar response of that execution of violence, and then how you read it if there is a difference.
I'm not sure if it changes between what and what.
The riot and the strike, so the way in which the state, and in particular the police, so the way in which they exert violence and power within the riot or the strike.
Yeah, I don't know if the police operates at a level of subtlety where it's easy to, the police know how to do two things. Hit people and shoot people. I think you note the important thing, which is the logic of property, which is really powerful. So this, I would turn to the occupation rather than the riot, right? One of the things that I would imagine some people in this room have even experienced, that I've certainly experienced, is when you're involved in an occupation movement, certain kind of occupations will be more or less permitted, at least in the short term, and certain kinds won't. If it's private property you're occupying, it won't be permitted. If it's a public square, they probably will, right? In fact, even Occupy Wall Street, that turned out not to be a public square. Zuccotti Park turned out to be owned by a corporation with a big tower next to it, but that seemed okay with people. But the second you move into a lobby or even into an abandoned building, the cops show up immediately with tear gas and plenty more. So you're quite right, that the logic of the police is founded entirely on a property regime in that situation. The logic of the police in individual moments is clearly also founded on various racialized relationships. And the dynamic of race and property is itself a fascinating one. I don't know. I think that there's a delicate dance that gets worked out. We should be honest, right? There's a delicate dance that gets worked out between strikers and police and between rioters and police that sometimes feels like a kind of complicity. There's a way that the riot actually needs the cops. There's endnotes essay we were talking about that's very thoughtful about this. There's a way that rioters need cops to, in fact, need cops to misbehave for the riot to grow in power, and that weird need is a problematic relationship. There's this great symbiotic relationship between unions and cops, right, which is I talked about the shifting sense of what a strike is over the course of the 20th century, so that eventually it becomes quite pacified and it's organized and you do certain things and not certain things, and you have to keep marching and you have to have a, if the strike will agree to obey certain laws, that it won't be repressed brutally by the police. And it's a way of staging just like these moments of rapprochement, so there won't be a total break. I mean, strikes once wanted, the IWW is a great example, to be a total break. But if the strike says, oh, we actually want to be a way of participating, that's a sort of compliance with the police, and then it won't be disciplined very, very violently. And this is a notable fact.
Do we have Jem here? Yeah.
Hi, thank you. I have an observation and a question, and I guess I'll start with the observation, which is the terms through which you've described this transition from periods of circulation to production to circulation is very helpful in understanding the two major trade partnerships that are currently on the table across the Pacific and the Atlantic as highly instrumental tools that are all about regulating circulation in that way, and that could be very helpful in increasing the urgency of attention to those processes. And the question relates to the term imagination and the possibility of conceptualizing outcomes, which seems to be the context in which you were referring to imagination. I'm curious about imaginative tools for collective identification, and that comes partly from having grown up in Thatcher's Britain, when at the point where I was aware of what was on the news, I was aware of what we would call a working class that identified collectively under Marxist terms as having their own power base understood through labor, which is something that under neoliberalism, as we know, has largely disappeared. What is the importance of the capacity of people to be able to identify imaginatively as a collective? It seems that under a strike that relates to there is a collective identification. Are you suggesting that in a riot there is more an inchoate affective eruption through which people happen to assemble, or is there also an important role for imaginative tools for collective identification? For example, in a Vancouver context, a tenants' revolt. Yeah.
What are you saying? That's a very complicated question. I'm not sure I can tease out all the strands of it. I think that a couple things I will say that maybe will be relevant and helpful and maybe won't be. I think that there's also important moments of disidentification, by which I mean, if you think about the last big miners' strike, Arthur Scargill's insistence on identification as labor without a recognition of the massive decrease in labor's position, I think proved one of the real limits to that strike, and one of the reasons it failed so completely in Thatcher's Britain. So I think that identification is not in and of itself good if you misidentify yourselves. As long as people keep on thinking that the workable form of collective action is traditional labor organization, for example, that's going to be a devastating limit, not a productive identification at all. So identification is not inherently good, and I think that's implicit in your question, what are the useful kinds of identification? I would say that in a riot, right, it's not inchoate. I would argue against this, but the collective identification is against an antagonist, right? It's a shared antagonist. It's not a shared identity. I hesitate to cite Giorgio Agamben, who's not a major thinker for me, but he gets this one right in The Coming Community when he talks about the Tiananmen Square gathering as the beginning of something. And he calls it like a whatever singularity. Is that what it's called, Agamben people? It's one of those fancy philosophy terms. But what he means is people are not there out of a shared identity except for their shared refusal of something outside of them, which is the current world as it is, or the current government, or the current labor order, or whatever it is. I think that negative identification will end up being a more powerful identification over the years to come than the positive identifications you propose. But that's not to say they can't work at a local level. The thing I want to say, here's the crudest thing I will say that I insist is people fight where they are, right? The story I want to tell in the book is about how where people are has changed. Where capital is has changed, and where people are has changed, and that's why fights change. People fight where they are, but that means people who are in a tenant relationship will fight as tenants. People who are still in productive sectors of the economy will fight as workers. Those things will continue to happen. So what matters to me is not so much what the identification is, but where people are and how clearly they recognize that. And that has to happen before imagination. Imagination is not ex nihilo. Imagination arises out of given actual situations, just as all theory does. Imagination is a kind of theory. It's a kind of theorizing of what's possible. And all theory arises out of concrete situations, not out of desires that are drawn from the ether. So that's my sense of how identification works. I don't know if that's useful.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question.
Ask Stan a question. He knows more about this than I do.
I have a microphone. I have a microphone.
Oh, you have a microphone. We'll have two more questions then.
Well, mine is a little bit of a joke. I am old, so I've been through a lot of those kind of situations that you described. And I have to say, I was a bit surprised about your reaction about the community and stuff, because it was like your community, commune and stuff like that. Sounds like to me like a very happy hippie of my days. And I was wondering if that's a joke, if you could clarify a little bit this. But the other one, I was wondering at what time you finished your book, and if you had time to reflect on what's going on in France right now, and in which you have an interesting transformation. Because as I kind of was surprised as well, I'm always surprised about what's going on. I was surprised to see that the cops actually, for the first time, I know, the cops are actually demonstrating in the street of Paris. They are not happy about what happened to them in their career, in their jobs, and they demonstrate. And what is interesting is that the demonstrators of the week before are the ones who are trying to kind of keep the cops in control. So I thought kind of is an interesting kind of twist in history. How do you react to this? What's going on in our world when we see this? Thanks a lot.
You're my favorite person. Yeah. So I should be clear about. So I'm going to hear two different questions there. I want to actually respond to them both, but swiftly I hope. I don't mean the commune in that hippie way, what I call a commune of withdrawal, where 12 people get a house in the country and move back to the land, as they used to say in the 70s, and 2 of them actually secretly have jobs and bring wages in, and they have a lot of cashew butter. That's not what I mean. No, literally, I define the commune as a struggle for people to reproduce themselves outside of the market and outside of the wage, which cannot be done without a direct attack on capital. There's no peaceful commune. Paris knew it in 1871. Shanghai knew it in 1927. Morelos knew it in 1913. Oakland knew it in 2011. There's no peaceful commune. There's no route to the commune that's groovy. And I want to be clear about that kind of struggle. As I finished the book well before what's happening in France. I agree that what's happening in France is very fascinating. I'm a little apprehensive about it. I was hopeful about Nuit Debout. I'm less hopeful now that it seems to be totally controlled by the CGT. I don't think the CGT union has a terribly good record of opening struggles onto revolutionary horizons. In fact, I think they have the opposite. I think this Martinez guy is dubious, and I think that unless the CGT hold on the current struggles is broken, there's not much hope for what's going to happen. Already we're seeing union marshals really cracking down on, sometimes violently. And I fucking hate the peace police. We're seeing union stewards cracking down, sometimes violently, on other demonstrators and protesters who are not protesting in the way that the union deems appropriate. And so, in that sense, I'm not optimistic. That said, of course, the optimistic factor is that France is in utter collapse in general, and there's going to be other and more kinds of struggles. This is not arising from nothing. This is arising from a real situation and will continue to arise. The question is whether it can arise beyond the limits of union organization, which showed its limits in 1968 and is by far more limited now. So I think it's a real weakness of Nuit Debout that it disappeared so quickly and yielded to the CGT. And my hopes is that something like that will reverse. But at the moment, I'm uncertain. As for cops complaining in the streets, it's actually not the first time, and it should never be taken seriously. I mean, whenever cops want to get paid more money, that I don't think makes them a friend of the proletariat, by which I don't just mean workers, but anyone who wakes up in the morning not knowing how they're going to get through the week, not having the reserves to get through. I think that historically, right, armies switch sides, cops don't switch sides. And this is a basic revolutionary fact over the last hundreds of years. Armies can be gotten to switch sides, navies can be gotten to switch sides, cops don't switch sides. So I don't think we should have any patience with them whatsoever.
So thank you.
I have a comment first that I don't know how much you know about the trade union movement in Canada, but it certainly is significantly more to the left than the United States, and there's a much larger proportion of much larger proportion of the workforce is in a union in Canada. I believe in the United States it's down to about 10%. Here it's fallen a lot, but it's at least around 30. Yeah. And the struggles in the labor movement have been more about working conditions, not so much about money. When you made some reference to, you know, something has gone on, but it wasn't a wage issue. I would say that today, most of the struggles of the trade union movement in Canada are about working conditions and health and safety issues, not so much about money, because money, of course, we can't squeeze it out of the capitalists, that's for sure. And also, the union movement here has done a lot to separate itself from the ideology of the unions in the United States. It's been a very important thing. But I want to ask you about the protests with the student movement in Quebec, in Montreal City specifically. And I wonder if you know about that. There's a whole thing about the code of silence in the media, which of course is run by the 1%, the wealthy. And certainly, I can tell you in Vancouver, if there is a protest, if no one is hurt and no damage is done to property, they have a rule that they do not report it. So therefore, like when people like you are going about and doing this analysis and collecting data, so much of the stuff isn't written down, which is very alarming. And so it gives a false sense about what's going on. Now in Montreal, Quebec has the lowest student fees in the country. But for those students, they want free education. Like they look to countries in Europe where it's free or very, very cheap. And so they engaged in a very strong political action to oppose the government and protest. In the English media, and my question is around also the suppression of information by the media. In the English media, nothing was heard about this until it reached a critical mass of 100,000 people in the streets every night in Montreal. This went on for a couple of weeks. Then we started to hear about it here. And then the government made a misstep by bringing in a piece of legislation that prevented anybody from congregating together, I think, if there was more than 5 people. So what they actually did was those two sides that you talked about, they brought those two together. And ultimately, this led to, in the next election, the fall of that government. Now, the new government, which made promises, didn't do everything. The students were able to keep the fees at a certain level. And there is a graduated increase happening, but for the meantime, it was an incredibly successful protest. But unfortunately, it doesn't get the recognition it's deserved. And those that do know about it in the rest of Canada, particularly amongst a lot of students, they just think, oh, those students, what are they talking about? It's so cheap for them. What's their problem? Why are they going on strike? But have you addressed the media and how it controls the spread of information when these things are going on?
The first thing I'll say is, I mean, thank you for that. It's true it wasn't as well covered as it could have been, but it was very familiar to me because I was there. Of course, I went to Printemps Terrible and spent a good amount of time there, and I had to give talks to people in French, which was fucking terrifying. My French is... at best. But I found it very moving, absolutely very, very moving. And I met with a lot of the students, and I'd done a lot of organizing on US campuses as well, where I'm a teacher, and it was very important to me. And I agree, it was extremely powerful. It won some reforms. I hope to see more struggles like that. And as I said, I think that the figure of the student is actually a critical figure for upcoming struggles. In some senses, it's always been the case. If you're a student or have ever organized with students, you probably know some of the difficulties and limits involved in that situation. That said, the history of 20th century struggles passes through campus after campus. There's no way around it. And it's deeply important. What's significant is that universities and the cégeps and so on used to promise a kind of upward mobility, which they simply no longer can. And everybody knows that. Like, this is now a generally known fact. And that's the political horizon, which is restructuring students' lives, which is that the debts that they do take on, I know far less debt in Canada than in the US. But the debts they do take on, there's no chance of them recovering them. There's no employment out there, and that makes for a very volatile political situation. As to how that should be addressed to the media, all right, I'll have a brief moment. This is the last question. I have a brief moment of advocacy. Don't talk to the media. Don't care. They won't help you. They won't. Just don't. Fight anyway. That's it. Thank you all so much.
On that note.